Some stories are not meant to scare you with screams or shadows. They frighten you by lingering, quietly, patiently, long after the last word is spoken. This is one of those stories. A mother, a child who never came home, and a question that continues to echo on rainy nights in Japan. This is the mother who still searches. Chapter 1: The woman standing in the rain. No one in the neighborhood could remember exactly when the woman first appeared. She did not arrive suddenly, nor did she cause any disturbance serious enough to draw the attention of the police. She was like the rain itself, at first only a few scattered drops. Quiet and easy to ignore, until one day people realized the entire road had already been soaked. They only began to truly notice her on nights when the rain lingered on and on. The kind of rain common to Japan's eastern suburbs, cold, persistent, never heavy enough to feel dramatic, yet slow and relentless as it seeped into the skin. Under the dim yellow glow of the streetlights, the woman stood silently by the roadside, her head slightly lowered, both hands gripping the handle of a worn umbrella. The umbrella was black, old enough that its metal ribs protruded through the fabric like exposed bones. She did not move. She did not avoid passing cars. She did not appear to be in any hurry. There was something unnaturally patient about the way she stood there, as if she had been waiting for a very long time, long enough that the concept of time itself no longer mattered. When someone passed close by, she would slowly lift her head. Her face was thin and pale, rainwater running down her hollowed cheeks. Her eyes were deep and dark, as though they had stared into a place without light for far too long. Then, in a hoarse voice that almost dissolved into the sound of falling rain, she would ask, "Excuse me, have you seen my child?" It was not an urgent question. There was no panic in her voice. Only a plea repeated again and again, steady and measured, like breathing. Those who stopped to look at her all shared the same unsettling feeling. They did not know how to answer. Not because the question itself was difficult, but because the woman's gaze made it feel as though their response no longer mattered. As if she was not truly listening, only fulfilling a ritual she could not abandon. Some turned away, telling themselves she was just a grieving mother who had lost her child, her mind no longer stable. Others felt a surge of pity and opened their mouths to comfort her, only to find their words caught in their throats the moment they met her eyes. Stranger still, after the woman appeared, the road always felt colder than it should have been. The air grew thick with moisture, carrying a faint, indescribable scent, something like children's clothes left forgotten in a damp closet for too long. And only after she turned away and faded into the rain did people notice the detail that sent a chill through their spines. On the soaked pavement where she had been standing, there were no footprints at all. Chapter 2: The child WHO disappeared in 1988. The file documenting the child's disappearance was stored in an old steel cabinet at the district police station. Wedged between reports of traffic accidents and petty thefts, nothing about it appeared remarkable. The folder had yellowed with age, its corners curled from years of humidity. On the first page, a few short lines were typed with cold efficiency. Haruto Tanabe, male, age 6, missing as of October 12, 1988. There were no words like tragedy. No mention of grief. Just a child who had vanished. That morning, rain had fallen since early dawn. Not the kind of storm that sparks panic, but a thin, persistent drizzle, enough to dull colors and encourage carelessness. Haruto was dismissed earlier than usual because one of the teachers had to leave unexpectedly. The boy wore a thin blue jacket and a yellow hat that sat slightly too large on his head as he waited for his mother at the kindergarten gate. Aiko Tanabe arrived to pick him up. As she did every day, she held Haruto's hand tightly. Several teachers later recalled the moment clearly. The mother bent down to straighten her son's collar, brushed rain from his forehead, and then the two of them walked away together. That was the last time Haruto was ever seen. About 30 minutes later, Aiko returned to the school in a state of panic. She said she had only crouched down by the roadside to retie her son's shoelace, just a few seconds. No more. When she stood back up, the small hand she had been holding was gone. The street was empty. The rain blurred everything. No one heard a scream. Police search efforts began that very night. Officers combed through every alley, Every storm drain, every vacant lot, search dogs were brought in, but Haruto's scent trail led only as far as the riverbank before vanishing completely. As if the child had dissolved into the air. 3 days passed. Then 7. Then 2 full weeks. There were no clues, no witnesses, no signs of abduction. When a veteran investigator quietly suggested that the child may have fallen into the river, Aiko did not cry. She stood motionless, staring through the window at the muddy water outside, as though waiting for someone to emerge from it. From that day on, Aiko began carrying an old photograph of Haruto with her. Carefully laminated, she showed it to everyone she met. Her eyes filled with a desperate, unhealthy hope, as if one person saying "I've seen him" would reverse everything. But no one ever saw Haruto again. What later unsettled those who reviewed the file was the final handwritten note, written in pale blue ink at the bottom of the report. The mother continues to insist that her son is still alive. Chapter 3. The mother WHO never went home. After Haruto disappeared, the Tanabe house slowly became a place that no longer belonged to the present. Neighbors said the lights inside were almost never turned off. Yet the mother was rarely seen entering. Aiko Tanabe still kept her house key, but she no longer slept on the old futon in the bedroom. She did not return home to rest, only stopping by briefly, like a visitor afraid to stay too long. During the day, people saw her at the bus terminal, standing dangerously close to the edge of the road, her eyes fixed on every vehicle that pulled in. At night, she appeared at the train station, silently walking along the deserted platform, bending down to peer into the darkness beneath the cars, where rainwater pooled into black puddles. She moved so constantly that some began to believe she no longer slept at all. Aiko's clothes were always damp. Her raincoat never fully dried. A smell of moisture clung to her, mixed with metal and cold rain, giving those nearby the unsettling sensation of standing beside a river in flood season. Some nights, neighbors heard footsteps outside their homes long past midnight. When they cautiously opened their doors to look, they saw Aiko standing in the middle of the street, both hands extended in front of her, as if holding someone much smaller. She leaned down, whispering gently, her voice terrifyingly tender, like a mother coaxing a stubborn child who refused to come home. But beside her, there was no one. One neighbor once gathered the courage to call out her name. Aiko slowly turned around. The porch light illuminated her face, revealing eyes sunken deep and bloodshot, no longer reflecting light. She smiled faintly and asked the familiar question, as though she had forgotten where she was. "Have you seen my child?" After that, no one dared speak to her again. The Tanabe house began to change. Mold spread across the walls with unnatural speed. Notes appeared everywhere, on doors, on furniture, on the walls themselves, each bearing Haruto's name, his birth date, his height, written again and again in frantic, uneven handwriting. On the dining table, a child's bowl of rice was always set out, untouched. People said that if you passed by the house at night, you could hear the soft scrape of a chair being pulled back, as if someone small were climbing onto the table. And soon after came the low whisper of a mother's voice, repeating endlessly, "Come home, mother is here." Chapter 4. The river that never returned a body. The river that ran through the neighborhood was not large. It was narrow and murky, its banks overgrown with weeds and littered with drifting trash. During the rainy season, the water level rose and the current quickened, carrying with it things that did not belong there: broken branches, plastic bags, sometimes the bodies of animals. The people who lived nearby were used to the idea that anything that fell into the river would eventually be returned somewhere downstream. There was only one thing that never came back. From the very first days of the search for Haruto, the police concentrated their efforts along that river. Nets were lowered into the water. Metal hooks scraped the riverbed. Officers waded in up to their waists, working for hours in the cold rain. Exhaustion etched clearly across their faces. Aiko always stood on the bank. She said nothing. She did not cry or beg. She only stared at the surface of the water, watching the small whirlpools form and disappear, as if she believed that if she watched long enough, her son would eventually step out onto the shore on his own. But day after day, the river returned nothing. No shoes, no jacket, no yellow hat. An older investigator, who who had worked in the area for more than 20 years, quietly told his colleagues that he had never seen a case like this. Even in the most difficult drowning cases, something always surfaced in the end. Here, it was as if the child had never touched the water at all. When the police informed Aiko that it was most likely Haruto had fallen into the river, she laughed. It was not the laughter of madness, but something dry and hollow, as though it came from deep within her throat. She shook her head slowly and said in a low voice, "No, my child isn't there." From that day on, Aiko began going to the river every night. She stood dangerously close to the edge, so near that one slip would have sent her into the water. She called her son's name over and over, her voice steady and flat, like a prayer with no end. Some people swore they saw the water ripple when she called. Others claimed they heard a child's voice answering her, very softly, from beneath the river's surface. One night, during a heavy downpour, neighbors saw Aiko bend down toward the water, reaching out as if to grasp something drifting against the current. When they rushed over, she was already standing upright again, her clothes soaked through, her eyes shining with an unnatural light. "I heard him," she said. "Haruto is still nearby." From that night on, people in the area began avoiding the river after dark, because there were nights when, even though no one stood there, they could still hear a mother's voice whispering along the riverbank, "I know you can't come home yet. I will keep searching." Chapter 5. The day the mother disappeared. No one noticed right away when Aiko Tanabe disappeared. For months before that, she had already lived without a fixed place. Not seeing her for a day or two had become normal. People only began to feel that something was wrong when her old umbrella stopped appearing by the riverbank, and the familiar road suddenly felt disturbingly empty. 3 days passed. Then 5. No one heard her voice anymore. The police were not notified until more than a week later, when the smell of dampness inside the Tanabe house grew unnaturally strong. The front door was unlocked. Inside, it was dark even during the day. Light slipped in through a narrow window, illuminating walls completely covered in paper notes. Haruto's name, his date of birth, lines of frantic handwriting repeated again and again, layered over each other, as if written during a long stretch of panic. On the dining table sat a bowl of rice, dried hard and speckled with green mold. Beside it lay a small pair of chopsticks meant for a child, neatly placed, as though someone were still expected to eat. In the bedroom, Aiko's futon was cold, showing no sign of having been slept on for months. The police found her umbrella leaning against the wall, its fabric torn even further, the metal ribs bent as if they had been crushed by a tight grip. There was no wallet, no identification, no sign of a struggle. What unsettled everyone most was this: there were no signs that she had left. No one saw Aiko board a train. No one saw her cross the street. No one heard her familiar voice calling out in the rain. One investigator stood for a long time in front of the note-covered wall before quietly saying, "She never intended to give up." The official search ended after 10 days. Aiko Tanabe's case was classified as a voluntary disappearance, accompanied by a note regarding her unstable mental condition. For the system, the story ended there. But for the people in the neighborhood, it was only the beginning. Because within a week of Aiko's disappearance, someone claimed to have seen a woman standing on the familiar road. In the rain, thin figure, tattered umbrella, the same unmistakable eyes. And that question, once again echoed, steady and cold, as if there had never been any interruption at all. "Have you seen my child?" Chapter 6. The woman returns. The first time anyone saw Aiko Tanabe after she had disappeared was on a rainy night toward the end of the month. No one could agree on the exact date. In that neighborhood, the rains seemed to blur together, stretching endlessly from one night into the next. Only one thing was certain: the air that night was colder than usual. And the road in front of the train station was so empty that the sound of rain felt as though it were falling inside one's head. A man coming off a late shift was the first witness. He said that as he approached the intersection, he noticed a figure standing beneath the streetlight, thin, slightly hunched, holding a familiar umbrella. At first, he thought it was a trick of exhaustion, but as he drew closer, his heart began to pound so violently that he had to stop. It was Aiko. She had not aged. She had not changed. It was as though time itself had forgotten to touch her. Her clothes were wet, yet no water dripped from them. Her hair clung to her scalp, plastered flat, and her skin was so pale that the streetlight seemed to pass through it, giving her a waxy, translucent look. When she lifted her head, her deep-set eyes fixed on the man without blinking. "Excuse me," she said, her voice so light it nearly dissolved into the rain. "Have you seen my child?" The man did not answer. He took one step back, then another. In that moment, he noticed something that made his throat go dry, despite the heavy rain. The ground beneath the woman's feet did not ripple at all. The rain passed through her silhouette, as though falling into an empty space. By morning, the story had spread quickly. At first, people dismissed it as coincidence, a woman who resembled Aiko, a rumor exaggerated by fear. But the number of witnesses kept growing, too many to ignore. Some saw her standing in front of the old kindergarten. Others encountered her at the bus stop after midnight. Always rain. Always the tattered umbrella. Always the same question. And always one unsettling detail in common. She never left the way a living person should. Those who watched her turn and walk away said she did not truly walk at all. Her figure faded gradually, blending into the curtain of rain like a streak of water on glass. Until nothing remained. There were no footsteps, no sound of departure. The police were notified. A few younger officers attempted to approach the woman on rainy nights. Yet every report contained the same chilling line. Unable to confirm that the subject possesses a physical body. From that night on, the residents of the neighborhood began avoiding the streets whenever it rained. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood the truth. Aiko Tanabe had returned. Not as a mother, but as something that refused to accept being forgotten. Chapter 7. Those WHO answered. Not everyone was able to remain silent when faced with the question of the mother in the rain. Some answered out of pity, some out of fear, others simply because they had no time to think. They spoke to her, and from that moment on, their lives began to fracture in ways that were difficult to name. The first recorded case involved a middle-aged woman who lived near the bus stop. She encountered Aiko one evening during a light rain. Hurrying home, when she heard the familiar question, she stopped, sighed, and replied softly that she had not seen the child. That she was sorry. The mother bowed her head in thanks and remained standing there in silence until the woman walked away. That night, the woman dreamed a strange dream. In it, she stood before a black river that reflected no moonlight. In the middle of the water stood a young boy, the river reaching up to his neck. His eyes were wide open, staring directly at her. His mouth moved as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. When she woke, her throat was raw and burning, as though she had been screaming all night. Then there was a young delivery worker. He answered the mother brusquely, only to end the encounter as quickly as possible. From that day on, he began hearing soft footsteps following him whenever it rained. When he turned around, there was no one there. Yet the sensation that a small hand was about to touch his back never left him. The dreams began to repeat among those who had answered her. Always water, always a child, and always the feeling that if they took even one more step forward, what stood before them would no longer be a dream. Some people woke with their fingernails packed with damp soil. Others heard a child calling their name from inside dark bathrooms. Some began to avoid rain, darkness, and eventually sleep itself. What frightened them most was not what they saw, but a thought that slowly formed in their minds, quietly, steadily, as if planted there by something deep within them. They had not helped enough. The child was still waiting. And at the same time, the mother's question began to echo inside their heads. Without rain, without night. Have you seen my child? The people of the neighborhood came to understand something, though no one dared to say it aloud. Answering the mother did not make her leave. It only made her remember you. Chapter 8. The Liar. The man's name was Mori. He lived alone in a small apartment near the train station and worked night shifts unloading cargo. Alcohol was the only thing that allowed him to sleep after long hours of labor. And the rain made his temper worse than usual. That night, when he saw the woman standing beneath the streetlight, he had no intention of stopping. But she lifted her head. And she asked. The familiar question drifted toward him. Weary, as though it had already been spoken thousands of times. A surge of irritation rose inside Maury, not toward the woman herself, but toward his own life. He did not want to listen to anything anymore. He did not want to be dragged into the pain of a stranger. So he lied. "I saw him," he blurted out, his voice rough with alcohol. "He's up ahead, near the river." For a moment, the rain seemed to stop. The mother stood perfectly still. Then, very slowly, she smiled. It was not a smile of relief, but the smile of someone who had finally been given permission to hope. She bowed deeply and thanked him in a trembling whisper. Maury turned away immediately. He did not look back, but the entire walk home, he had the unmistakable feeling that he was no longer walking alone. The footsteps behind him were lighter and slower than his own, yet they never disappeared. That night, Maury did not dream. He woke just before dawn with his throat burning and his mouth filled with the metallic taste of mud. In the bathroom, faint handprints, small, unmistakably those of a child, were smeared across the mirror at a height no adult could reach. His neighbors were the first to notice something was wrong. The light in Maury's apartment stayed on for 2 full days without a sound from inside. When the police forced the door open, the room was unnervingly empty. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no body. Only one thing had been placed carefully in front of the door. An old umbrella, torn, still dripping with rainwater despite the clear weather. A few days later, some people swore they had seen the mother in the rain no longer standing alone. Beside her, slightly lower, was a small shadow. It had no clear face, only a shape darker than the surrounding darkness. From that point on, a new rule spread through whispered conversations, passed like a curse. If you meet the mother, do not answer. And above all, do not lie. Because once she believes you know where her child is, she will never allow you to walk alone again. Chapter 9. The child WHO follows. At first, it was the adults who noticed the change in the children, not through direct stories, but through small, unsettling signs, wandering eyes, restless sleep, and a vague fear they could not put into words. The children in the neighborhood began waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering sentences that made no sense. A young girl who lived near the river told her mother that a boy stood outside her window whenever it rained. He did not knock. He did not call out. He only pressed his face against the glass, his breath leaving long, foggy streaks. When the mother rushed to the window, there was nothing outside but rain and the warped shadows of trees. Another child said that someone held his hand lightly on the way home from school. The hand was cold, wet, and smaller than an adult's. When he turned around, no one was there, yet the damp imprint of a small hand remained on his sleeve, refusing to dry for the rest of the day. At first, these stories were dismissed as imagination. Then a boy from the neighborhood disappeared. He left home on a rainy afternoon, saying he would be back soon. 3 hours later, only his school bag was found, placed neatly by the riverbank. Inside, his books and notebooks were completely dry, even though the grass around it was soaked. After that incident, the children began saying the same things, too similar to be coincidence. They said the boy had gone with his mother. They said there was a woman who often stood far away, watching them. And beside her, there was always a child. That child did not speak, did not smile. He only stared, as though comparing. Some nights, parents heard soft footsteps in the hallway. When they opened their children's bedroom doors, they found them sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open in the darkness, whispering the same sentence over and over. The boy's mother is still searching. From then on, parents forbade their children from going outside when it rained. Windows were covered, night lights stayed on, but the fear was no longer outside. It had entered their homes. And somewhere, in the steady sound of falling rain, a mother continued to walk hand in hand with a child who did not belong to this world, searching for another hand, still warm. Chapter 10. The photographs without the mother. At first, no one believed the images. People had grown accustomed to rumors, to imagination, to stories exaggerated by fear after every rainy night. But machines were different. Machines did not feel pity. They did not feel fear. And they did not lie. The traffic camera at the intersection near the train station had been newly installed after an accident. It ran continuously, recording every movement, every passing shadow beneath the streetlights. One rainy night, while a technician reviewed the footage to verify timestamps, he discovered a segment that brought the surveillance room to complete silence. In the frame, the road was empty. Rain fell steadily, streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt in long, shimmering streaks. Then, from the edge of the screen, a woman stepped into view. Thin, slightly hunched, holding a torn umbrella. The camera captured her clearly. But when the image was enlarged, something impossible became obvious. The woman cast no shadow. Beneath the streetlight, where a shadow should have stretched across the ground, there was only an empty blur of rain. That was not all. When the footage was slowed frame by frame, it became clear that the woman's hand was not clasping empty air. Her fingers curved slightly inward, as though holding a much smaller hand. Under the streetlight, the surface of the road at that exact spot sank ever so slightly, just enough to form a faint depression. As if something heavy and low to the ground was standing there. Despite being invisible on camera, a technician's hands trembled as he pointed at the screen, explaining that the pressure sensors embedded beneath the road had recorded two distinct points of weight at that moment. But the camera showed only one person. The footage was never released publicly. It was labeled a technical anomaly, archived for internal reference, and quietly forgotten, yet rumors leaked out regardless. And those who had already seen the mother in the rain understood. The machines were merely confirming what they had long feared. After the video existed, reports of the child who follows increased sharply. Some people saw small footprints appear beside adult footprints on wet pavement, only to stop abruptly. Others heard paired footsteps echoing through dark hallways, one heavy, one light. The mother was no longer searching alone. And from that moment on, her question took on a different meaning. It was no longer a plea. It was a confirmation. She was not only searching for her child. She was proving that he was still here. Chapter 11. Do not look back. The rule never appeared in any official announcement. It was not written on notice boards, broadcast over loudspeakers, or delivered by police warnings. The rule existed only in whispered conversations and in the averted gazes of those who had passed that road on rainy nights. If you meet the mother, keep walking. Do not stop. And above all, do not look back. No one remembered exactly where the rule came from. Perhaps from someone who survived, or perhaps from someone who was no longer there to explain why fear had taken hold so deeply. The first person to break the rule was a university student renting a room nearby. That night, the rain was light, just enough to turn the road into a mirror of blurred streetlights. He heard the familiar question behind him, very close. Close enough that a cold breath brushed against the back of his neck. He walked faster. Then faster still. But the feeling of being followed did not fade. Finally, he turned around. The mother was standing directly behind him, not several meters away, not beneath the streetlight, but so close that if he had raised his hand, his fingers would have brushed the cold, wet fabric of her clothes. Her face no longer carried the weary expression people remembered. Her eyes were opened unnaturally wide, the black of her pupils spreading until they reflected his distorted image like warped glass. And then he realized something that made his heart seize. The mother was not looking at him. Her gaze was directed lower. Right beside him, there, near his feet, was a darkness thicker than the surrounding night. A low, wet shape stood silently. He could not see its face clearly, only a thin neck submerged in black water, and small hands slowly lifting upward, as if asking to be held. The student screamed. The next morning, he was found crouched in the middle of the road. His clothes were dry, despite the rain that had fallen all night. He was not injured, he had not disappeared, but his eyes were empty, unresponsive to any question. The only thing he repeated, over and over, for days afterward, was a single broken sentence. She wasn't alone. And she didn't want me to look. From that day on, the rule was passed along with greater certainty than ever before. Because there are things that, once you have seen them, begin to look back at you. Chapter 12. She is not searching for her child. It was only when the disappearances of children began to follow a pattern that people dared to consider a theory no one had wanted to touch before. Not the police, not the authorities, but ordinary residents who had lived with fear long enough to recognize that what was happening was not random. The children who vanished shared the same traits. They were often alone. They had spoken about seeing the woman in the rain. And most importantly, they had talked about the child who stood beside her. A folklorist, someone who specialized in collecting stories dismissed as superstition, came to the neighborhood. He listened far more than he spoke, wrote down very little, and finally offered a conclusion that left the room in complete silence. That mother, he said, is no longer searching for her child. No one argued. But no one felt relieved either. According to him, in Japanese folk belief, there are spirits bound by a single overwhelming emotion: grief, regret, despair. When such a spirit cannot accept its loss, it continues to reenact the final role that defined it in life, repeating the same action endlessly. Aiko Tanabe could not accept Haruto's disappearance. But as time passed, the memory of the real child began to fade. What remained was only the role of a mother who searches. And a role, if it exists long enough, requires an object to sustain it. The child walking beside the mother was no longer Haruto. It was a hollow space shaped like a child. A shadow temporarily filled by other children, until they no longer fit. The mother did not abduct. She replaced. The children who disappeared were not dragged away. They followed willingly, drawn to the most familiar image in the world: a mother searching for her child. Arms open, waiting, to a child. This was not a threat, it was a promise of safety. And when a new child walked beside her, the previous shadow dissolved. But only for a while. Because the mother was never truly satisfied. She did not find her child. She only postponed her loss. At the end of the folklorist's notes was a single handwritten line. Uneven and hurried, as if written too late. The mother will continue to search. As long as there are children who see her as a mother. Chapter 13: The Last Rainy Night. That year, the rain came earlier than usual. It was not the familiar light drizzle that lingered for days, but a heavy, unrelenting downpour that lasted without pause, swelling the river and forcing the road near the train station to be temporarily closed. The local authorities decided to widen the road and fill in part of the old riverbank, the very place where the mother had so often stood. Officially, it was a matter of infrastructure. Unofficially, those who had lived there long enough recognized the familiar scent of something being quietly buried. The last rainy night came just before construction began. No one saw the mother arrive. She was simply there, standing beneath a flickering streetlight, her old umbrella open as always. Yet something felt different. The air was thick, heavy enough that the sound of rain seemed to fall more slowly. The river churned with strange currents, its water darker than it had ever been. The few people who still dared to go outside watched from a distance. No one approached. No one wanted to be the last person to see her. The mother did not ask. She did not call out. She did not search. She only stood there. Beside her, the small shadow stood motionless as well, more still than ever before. There was no longer any sense of comparison. No probing gaze, only a weary waiting, as if both of them had grown exhausted from walking the same path for far too long. When the rain reached its heaviest, the mother bent down. For the first time in years, she did something different. She let go. The small shadow did not fall. It sank straight into the wet pavement, dissolving into the flowing water that ran toward the river. There was no cry, no struggle, only a quiet disappearance, like a final breath finally allowed to end. The mother straightened. The streetlight illuminated her face, revealing an expression no one had ever seen before: not grief, not hope, but absolute emptiness. Then she turned away and walked off. And this time, her figure did not fade into the rain. She walked toward the river. The next morning, the road was bare. There was no umbrella, no trace of her presence. The rain had stopped. Construction began as scheduled. The riverbank was partially buried beneath fresh concrete, the old edge erased. People said it was finally over. No more missing children. No more woman in the rain. No more whispered questions in the night. Yet something lingered, an unease difficult to name. Like waking from a nightmare that lasted too long, unsure whether you were truly awake. Because there are things that do not disappear. They simply stop being seen. Chapter 14: The Knocking at the Door. In the years that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. The new road was wider, the river hidden behind concrete railings, and rainy nights no longer caused people to hold their breath in fear. New residents knew nothing of the mother in the rain. Longtime residents stopped speaking of her, as though silence itself could erase memory. But fear did not vanish with the place. It changed the way it approached. The first report of knocking came late one night during a light rain. It was not a loud, startling sound, but a series of very soft, patient taps, like the way a child knocks when afraid of disturbing a sleeping adult. The man in the house stood up, heart racing, yet told himself it was only someone at the wrong door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. No one stood there, only rain falling quietly, and air that felt colder inside the house than out. He closed the door. The knocking returned immediately, this time, closer, as if the hand tapping did not touch the door itself, but the space just inside it. Similar incidents began to surface, always late at night, always when it rained, and always accompanied by a faint whisper that slipped through wood, through cracks, through the listener's sense of reason. "My child, is he here?" No one ever saw who stood outside. Doorbell cameras recorded only empty hallways, sometimes with a patch of low, distorted static near the floor. Not clear enough to prove anything, but enough to ensure no one wanted to watch the footage twice. There was another detail these cases shared. Everyone who heard the knocking had once lived in the old neighborhood. They had walked past that road, heard that question, and believed the story had ended. The only response passed along by word of mouth was simple: "Do not open the door." Those who kept the door closed said the knocking stopped after a few minutes, leaving behind a heavy silence, as though someone had departed in disappointment. But those who opened their doors, no one among them ever described what happened next. They did not disappear. There were no missing person reports. They continued to live. But from that day on, there was always one room in their homes that was never used. One door that remained closed. And sometimes, on rainy nights, the light in that room would turn on by itself, even though no one had entered. Chapter 15: The Mother is Still Searching. People no longer try to decide whether the mother is a ghost, a vengeful spirit, or merely a memory that refuses to fade. After so many years, giving her a name no longer feels important. What remains is the persistence of the question itself, repeating in different places, under different circumstances, like an echo that never finds an ending. The story of the mother in the rain is no longer confined to the old neighborhood. Some claim to have heard her question in newly built residential areas. Others say they heard the familiar whisper while passing a school late at night. Always soft, always patient, as if the speaker is willing to wait forever. Children born after those events sometimes say things that prevent adults from sleeping peacefully. They ask why a woman stands far away, watching them when it rains. They say she is not frightening, only sad. That she is looking for someone who was lost a very long time ago. No one is certain anymore whether the child she searches for ever truly existed. Haruto Tanabe may have died in 1988. He may have vanished into the river without leaving a trace. But in the stories that continue to circulate, his name grows fainter with each retelling. What remains is only a mother who cannot stop searching. And perhaps that is the most terrifying thing of all. Because the mother is not searching for a specific child. She is searching for an answer, something no one can give her. A confirmation that her waiting is not meaningless. The residents of the old neighborhood maintain a peculiar habit. When they encounter a woman standing in the rain, they bow their heads ever so slightly. A quiet gesture of respect. They do not stop. They do not speak. They do not answer. They keep walking, carrying their fear like a protective charm. Something that reminds them there are things better left untouched. Because if, on some cold rainy night, you hear a gentle voice very close to you ask, "Is my child here?" Remember this. She does not need your help to find him. She only needs you to acknowledge that she is still searching. And once you do, that search will never truly end. The rain eventually stops. The streets grow quiet. And life moves on, as it always does. But somewhere, in the space between memory and loss, a mother is still walking. Still asking. Still searching. So if you ever hear a gentle voice behind you in the rain, asking about a child who never returned, don't answer. Don't turn around. And remember, some searches were never meant to end.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.